Hello everyone, and thank you very much for joining this live event. In this series of lessons we will discuss reactive apps with Spring. It's a complete new subject that you don't find in a different playlist on this same channel, and I hope you will enjoy this series of lessons as well as you did with the others. Of course, this one is not a beginner, so I expect that you already know some things about fundamentals with Spring before starting with this series of lessons. In case you don't, then I recommend you find my Spring fundamentals lessons first. You have it in a playlist on this same channel, and you can start with this one before going into reactive applications. If you're watching the event live, don't forget that you have a live chat there, so you can ask questions directly in the live chat and start discussions as you usually do. If you're watching the event recorded, then don't forget that you can leave questions in the comment section. And of course, I always advise you follow me on Twitter and LinkedIn as well, because sometimes YouTube doesn't notify me on the questions. So maybe I forget about the question, then you will have to push me to get an answer for that. So again, thank you very much for joining, and let's start today's lesson. Lesson number 1 about Spring Reactive. And unlike other similar lessons, I won't start discussing the contracts, the fundamental contracts, and how they work, and terms like back pressure, things that you will learn throughout the whole series of lessons. I will rather start more practical, and I will show you today how to create from the endpoint to repository a whole Spring application. Of course, it will be a demonstrative example, a very simple application, but we will create a whole application that exposes a REST endpoint that might be consumed by a client. We will discuss about what kind of clients can consume this endpoint. You will see that in case of a reactive app, it makes a lot of sense that the client should also be reactive, and if that's not the case, then you will see that you'd have a pseudo reactive application rather than one that really helps you. And that is basically for today's lesson. It's a warm-up. It's going to seeing which are the interfaces and classes we use, and then all of this will be detailed throughout all the next lessons in the series that I will put in the playlist, and you will see from now on. I will schedule from time to time a new lesson on the stream. So I need to create a project, but first of all, let me tell you what kind of application we will be implementing. So I will have an application that exposes a REST endpoint, and it will also communicate with a database. Again, I do expect that you have the fundamentals of already, so I do expect that you already know many things, and if you don't, then what you need to do is go to the Spring Fundamentals playlist first before going into this series of lessons. Otherwise you might feel them difficult to digest. So that's why I feel comfortable to start with a more complex example where I already use a database, because I expect that many of you, or at least you, should at least have part of the knowledge, of the basic knowledge I discussed in other playlists on this same channel. So that's why this example, even if it's the first lesson, it might look to you complicated in case you don't know already what these things are. So you need to have them first from the fundamental stream. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to have a simple table in the database and expose all the records in the table through a REST endpoint in a reactive way, in a reactive approach. And in order to observe what reactive means, I will also somehow simulate that we process somehow those records. I will add a fake delay for each of the records, and that will show you basically that when implementing reactively an application, you don't think about a response anymore as one piece of information that's being communicated from one end to another, but rather more than a stream of values that are taken, consumed by a client whenever they are ready. Whenever you have something on the pipe, which is called an event, you consume that event and then you can use it, and that's the client what's doing. So big difference you will observe between standard web applications and reactive web applications is that instead of thinking about an endpoint as being a resource you consume and you get something back sometimes, in this case you will think about it about like a way to send events and to get events, and that way the data is like on a pipeline, is consumed and processed on a pipeline rather than in an exchange, request response exchange, as we usually do in standard web applications. And I will also spice my lessons with showing you how this looks like behind the scenes, because when we will use reactive implementations, you will see another interesting thing is the fact that the app doesn't create behind the scenes a thread for each request as it used to do in a standard web application. You will see that it works differently, but too much information up front, so let's just start with the example and then see what comes throughout our implementation. So what I'm going to do, I'm making sure that I create a database. I will use a relational database. Surprise, surprise, you can use relational databases with reactive applications, just that, as you will see, you will have to have a specific driver with that, otherwise you will have a pseudo reactive application. For many years we didn't have a way to implement reactively working with a relational database, that only worked with a few non-relational implementations such as MongoDB, that I think was one of the first to have a reactive implementation. Now you can do that with a relational database such as MySQL in this case. So let me show you how to do that. So I have a schema here, test, and I have a table, and I will create a very simple table, because we don't really care about what we store in the database. It's just the idea of creating an app endpoint to database. So I will just name this product, and I will assume it has a primary key. I will just mark it as auto incremented, and then I will have a name for my product, and I think that's more than enough. And I will make sure I will add a couple of products in my database, so that now what I will do is I will get the values from the database, and I will simulate processing them somehow, because I don't have a way to process them today at least, and I don't want to implement too much up front, but we need to see something, and then I will simulate that using a delay. So here is my table in this test schema, and then I should be able to add something here. So say I want to add a product beer, sorry, and a product chocolate. Okay, and this will be all the products in my database that I will use. So this is everything I need for my very simple today's implementation. Okay, now it's better to see them. And of course, now I go to my IntelliJ, and I will have to create a new project. And I have a question in the chat that says, socket versus reactive web, could you explain any use case? I will do that, but I will do that when we get into that lesson where we discuss about RSocket. So I will have a lesson on RSocket. Of course, I will take them one by one, because the difference in between this channel and others is that here we take all the lessons one by one, and I start with the very beginning, and then everyone can grasp easily the information. So yes, I will discuss WebSockets and reactive WebSockets, but that will be much later when we get into that subject. How should I call this? So maybe I call it Spring Reactive C1 E1, and then I will, as usually, I will put my projects on my GitHub account, so you can take them as well if you want. and then I say next, and let me select from here. So I want, first of all, I want a reactive web application. Secondly, I want Spring Data JDBC, and then I would like to use the MySQL driver because that's the database I use. You've seen here my MySQL workbench, the client that I use to connect to my database management system. Yes, also at some point, maybe you are going to ask about that as well. We are going to discuss about how to secure reactive applications at some point, but at the moment we don't do that. When I will do that, I will have to add the Spring Security, dependency as well. Yes, I'm going to make a complete series on reactive, exactly. So that's what I'm going to do. That's why I'm not now answering the question about socket and RSocket, because that will come at a separate lesson when we get that point. Servlet versus reactive is basically what we discuss now, but it will not be something that you will understand from only one lesson. You will have to follow multiple lessons to understand that, because I will have a lot to show on that. So that's what we are discussing now. So what we implement now is called the reactive web application, and this is different than the standard web application, that one that we call the servlet web application sometimes, because you might recall from when we discussed about standard web applications in the Spring Fundamental series, is that in Spring MVC there is this dispatcher servlet that directs the calls to a controller behind the scenes. But in this case we don't have a servlet behind the scenes, and in this case you will see that we don't even have tomcat behind the scenes. We will need a different implementation of the server, which is the reactive implementation, and by default with Spring Boot today this is Netty. Netty is the convention, it's considered the convention, and is the reactive server implementation that Spring Boot will configure behind the scenes unless you override that configuration somehow. So we don't do that, which means that in our case we will have Netty. Okay, enough talk, let's press on that finish button. I don't need this window anymore, and so I will close it and start our empty project from the very beginning. And let me see. So I should have a look in my POM XML file and make sure that I have everything in place. I use Java 17, but that's not a must. So I usually, as you know, use the latest version in my examples, but you can use Java 8 or Java 11 if you wish. For this stream it doesn't really matter, because we won't focus on Java as a language. We will focus specifically on reactive applications. Cool. So yes, indeed, Netty, that is what we will have instead of Tomcat, to answer you, Summit. So we have all the needed dependency hopefully here from what I see, and we have the reactive MySQL dependency here as well. So everything is in place and should be fine. So let me go and start writing my example. As I usually do, you may recall from other streams that I do prefer to structure my application. So I will start with the fact that I need controllers, of course. So I need to have controllers. The controllers will be REST controllers exposing my endpoints. You will learn later in other lessons that you can implement reactive endpoints with controllers and the same annotations that we used to also use with Spring MVC apps, but we have also the configuration alternative that you will learn. I will get to that at some point in one of the future lessons. Yes, to answer when we can use Spring Reactive LTS, that's something that I cannot answer you in a sentence now. You will have again to follow and understand first what reactive is, and then you will get throughout multiple lessons the answer to that question. So to answer the question, when it's better to use reactive and when it's better to use the servlet approach in general, that's something you will get throughout multiple lessons. I cannot have a simple answer to that. And that's why first this example will just open your eyes on what and actually what a reactive application is, and which are the main things we will continue to see from now on, but then things will get more and more detailed. Okay, so what else do I need? I will need some repositories, because I said I will take from the database the data, and then I will simulate some kind of a service. So allow me to also have a service as well. And then, because I need a way to model the product, which is my table in the database, I will create a model package where I will basically even start with this class. That should be the simplest I need. So when I'm basically going to I think I might have forgot something from the POM XML. So no, I added the Spring Data Starter. Sorry for my short memory is having problems. So I did add everything that I need, and then I will add product. And then if this is the model, if this is what models in my case the table in the database, then I will have to add some fields representing the columns, so private, string, name and ID, and or it's mandatory that one of them is represented as the ID, and I do that using the ID add notation. So that should be it. And of course in many cases, and even in this stream from now on, you might see me using Lombok, because I don't really like to write getter setters and make the builders myself in a real world example, and I will do that as well here. But since I didn't now add the Lombok dependency, let's just create the getters and the setters for the moment and focus on what we need to learn, which is actually reactive apps in this case. So then I do have the repositories, and in case of the repositories, I will create an interface that I will name just product repository in my case. So product repository, it should be an interface since I will be using Spring Data, and you have to be very attentive. This interface needs to extend one of the Spring Data contracts, but the Spring Data contract that we will extend is called Reactive CRUD repository. And if you know the basics of Spring fundamentals and you have some idea about Spring Data, you know that in case of Spring Data, usually we have CRUD repository, not the reactive CRUD repository, and just above CRUD repository we have the repository interface, which is a marker interface. What you will see if you go inside this reactive CRUD repository is that it is not extending from the standard CRUD repository but directly from the repository itself, which makes it somehow in the tree of inheritance to be parallel with the CRUD repository. So it's basically a totally different contract, a totally different implementation if you implement the reactive CRUD repository. Yes, not in this lesson, Katalin, thank you for the questions. The question is, are you going to cover web client as well? Since web client is basically the tool you need to use to consume endpoints, then yes, we are going to discuss about it, mandatory. It will be most likely even in the next lesson, because we will expose an endpoint today. Next lesson we will consume it, but we will have to leave it for next lesson because we will definitely not have enough time to do that as well into this lesson. But as I told at the very beginning, this will be a stream with everything that's fundamental and a must to know on reactive Spring applications. So we do extend the reactive CRUD repository, and basically same as in the case of any other Spring Data repository, you have to provide some generic types. The first generic type is the type of entity. It's basically the class representing the table in the database. And then the second one is integer. Of course, it's not a problem. I've used the primitive here. In this case, the only difference is that of course using it on generic type, I cannot do it with a primitive type. due to Java limitations. I need to use the wrapper class, but I can use either the primitive type or the wrapper class when I implement. The only difference being that the wrapper class can hold a null, the primitive cannot hold null, but since it's a primary key, it doesn't make a lot of difference on that. So will you cover project reactors separately? So since we depend on the project reactor, that will be part of our lessons as well. So it will be part of the next lessons when we will start going into details on how to use the publisher, subscriber, and the other basic contracts in the reactive. So now going back, so public interest part product repository, that's already enough for me, and I'm going to create my, say, product service. And in my product service, I need to use the service in the service annotation to make this a bin in the context. Remember that the stereotype annotations are only used to instruct Spring to add bins in the context. You can find them more detailed in my book Spring Start Here, but as an idea, one common mistake I see is people adding annotations such as at component, at repository, or at service on interfaces. Mind that this is not needed, so we don't need to add any annotation here. The product repository is an interface which is an abstract structure in Java, and the implementation, the bin itself, is configured automatically in the context by Spring Data. Cool. So now I'm going to create to inject here in the service the repository, and then create the use case, which is the service method. So product repository. Usually I don't need to define a constructor since I'm using Lombok, but I will simplify this example being the first one, and then from the next lesson we might start to use Lombok as well. And I'm going now to just what I need here is return all the products in the database. So say I get all the products in the database and then I process them somehow, and then they will be provided as a response to a RESTful API. What I'm going to do here is return all the products as a stream of products, because when we think reactively, we don't think, again, going back to what I said at the beginning of the lesson, at a collection that we return, but we are thinking at a stream of events that we are returning. So if for a usual implementation, I would have used here a list, for example, or a set or a collection of any type, then in this case I will use something that is called Flux. And I'm not going to go into a lot of details today about what Flux is. I want to just imagine this Flux is a pipeline of events, and the products, which is basically the object I will define as a generic type as well, is the event that is flowing through this pipeline, through this pipe, whatever you can imagine that. So question in the chat, can you repeat why we don't need a repository annotation in this case? I believe. So in this case, product repository, it's an interface. Component, repository, component, service, and any other stereotype annotation are useful only to instruct Spring that it needs to add an instance of that specific class in its context. But Spring can only instantiate what can be instantiated in Java, which is concrete, non-abstract types. So in this case, for example, you can add service, which is a stereotype annotation, to the product service class, since it's a class. And by this annotation, you want to add an instance of this class in Spring context. But in case of product repository, it's an interface. You would anyway not be able to create an instance of the interface. You can at most create an instance of a class, a concrete class extending the interface. Hence, adding a repository here makes no sense, because Spring would not anyway be able to instantiate, to create an instance of this type, being an abstract type. So that's something you will also find in my Spring Fundamentals series, and also in my book explained what stereotype annotations are. They are annotations we use to mark classes, to instruct Spring, to add an instance of that class into the context. Add repository annotation, transit exception, SQL exceptions, more generic JPA exception. Then how we handle JPA, this exception in this service. Let's go to JPA and discuss JPA in a stream about JPA. Since this is not about something non-reactive, I would like to keep focusing on what reactive is and take the discussion about non-reactive stuff like JPA and Hibernate in a separate stream, if you agree. Cool. Okay, I'm actually thinking about Spring Reactive in action if I will have the time, but I'm not sure about that. Let me now continue my explanation because I don't want to lose a lot of things. Again, this is just the first lesson, so we get warmed with what Reactive is. So I don't want you to have too many expectations now that in 1 hour I will teach you Reactive, because trust me, that's not possible. I'm sorry to disappoint you, but you will not be experts in Reactive in 1 hour. So let me just warm you up with this application so you get a feeling, at least if you've never seen Reactive or if you've seen it not too much, about what Reactive is. So I told you, I won't explain you what Flux is now. I don't want to do that. That will come in one of the next lessons. For the moment, just imagine this Flux is not a collection, as list or set would have been when I used them with non-reactive implementations. Just imagine this Flux as being a pipe throughout you can push events, and in our case these events are the products themselves. And then I'm going to say this get products. So the question is, do we need the entity annotation to model classes? In this case, no, because the entity annotation is a JPA annotation and we are not using JPA here. So as you can see, even the ID annotation is not the one from JavaX persistence, so it's not the one from JPA, it's a different annotation that is defined in Spring. So you use at entity when you define entities, which are the ways we define tables through objects when we use a JPA implementation such as Hibernate. But in our case here, we don't use Hibernate or any other JPA implementation. So in this case, no, we don't need to add entity for this. Okay, so we don't need it because it's not a JPA implementation. Yes, exactly. So these are basic Spring contexts. I will sometimes take some time to explain them, but it will be much better if you go and review the Spring fundamentals or take Spring Start here and review the Spring fundamentals. This playlist will mostly be with more advanced stuff, so I do expect you already have some of this knowledge. So I will not be able to explain everything again, just what I have already explained in the other playlist, because otherwise I will not have the time to focus on Reactive. So I don't need to create any annotation here. What I'm going to do is just use the repository and say product repository find all, and do observe that find all and all, we have a find all here, we have a find all by ID, we have some delete methods, we have the save methods. What do they look like? They do look like any other Spring Data repository. So if you've used Spring Data, and I hope you've at least used the fundamentals of Spring Data, you know that, and you are already customized with all these methods. So they sound familiar to you. What I want you to observe is that, however, they do return different things. So in case of this product repository, just because it is a reactive contract, it's an extension of a reactive contract, in this case they do not return anymore a collection like it used to do, for example, for the CRUD repository. they or an iterator, as they used to do for other non-reactive contracts. They do return flux. So it's not a coincidence I've used flux here. It is because this is the way in which we define a pipeline of events in Reactive. What you will learn in the next lessons is that this flux is actually what we call, and my IntelliJ is stuck for a while. It's actually what we call a publisher. So what you will see is that at some point, somewhere in its inheritance tree, it extends an interface that is called publisher. So this is the main contract representing someone who creates events, because as you will learn in reactive applications, you have two different actors, someone creating events, someone consuming them. So we are basically creating events here. Our application will create events, and this flux is just like a pipeline of events created. So now what I'm going to do is use the find all, and I can just close everything like this. But if I will close everything like this, you will not see a lot of a difference between what this reactive application would do against another reactive application. So what I will do also is I'm going to add some kind of a delay here. I will say delay elements. This is equivalent to, for any element, add a sleep duration. Let's call it a sleep duration. It's somehow for me simulating that we are doing something with those elements, because as you will see, it makes a lot of sense. It doesn't just help me at all taking the products from the database reactively and returning them. Usually here in a service class, I would have implemented a use case. That means here I would have had some logic behind the scenes, and that logic for each element might take some time. So what I want to do here is, instead of processing everything and then returning, like in my case, processing all the products and then returning them, I want to take the products one by one, and when I'm done with one of them, I return it. I'm done with one, I return it, so that my client gets the products in time once they are once my application finished with them. It doesn't have to wait. If I have 10 products, it doesn't have to wait for all of them to be ready in order for the whole response to be sent. It will simply get the values once they are ready. So this is specific to our reactive application. And of course, let us say here duration of seconds. And let's add enough seconds just to make them this aspect visible. I will say duration of 5 seconds. That means my whole method here, in my case, should take a little bit more than 10 seconds, because I have 2 products in the database. So it will take 2 products here, the beer and the chocolate, those that I've added in the database earlier, the beer and the chocolate. They will be extracted one by one, and then for each one of them the application will wait for 5 seconds. But even though the whole method takes 10 seconds to execute, a bit over 10 seconds, the client will not get everything only after 10 seconds. It will get first product after 5 seconds, and then at the end we will get the second product. And if I would have had 10 products here, then the method would have taken 50 seconds to execute, but the client would have get the values one by one once it's possible. So in this case, I'm just going to go to the controllers and create my product controller. And again, you will learn that you can use a REST controller, and you can use the same methods you might be already customized with, annotations such as get mapping, post mapping, put mapping, request mapping. If you'd like something more generic, you can use that. You can continue using that. Today we will use this. In the next lesson, I will teach you also how to declaratively define your routes, which means declaratively define I can call them endpoints, although it's not really correct to call them endpoints. Let's just call them the points to connect for a client and get the events. In our case, even though they look like endpoints, and even though even I and others, we use the name endpoints, theoretically they are not like really endpoints, because these are not really REST services. Anyway, again, remember it's just the first application. So I'm going to say product service here, product service. If I want to use constructor injection, then I need to declare my constructor, and then I'm going to say flux of products, get products, and I'm going to use the get mapping annotation, specifying the path where I'm getting the products, and then the only thing I'm doing is just calling the method. And there is one more thing that I really need to do, because if I don't do it, this will still be treated as a normal endpoint and you will get everything at the end. If I really want this to be treated as streams, I need to specifically configure this method to use a media type stream. I don't actually understand why my IntelliJ sometimes is so weird. So it doesn't want to. Okay, I've seen it here. This is the one, and I call event stream value. Okay, which means I'm not producing here a JSON, a simple JSON. I'm producing events. This is really important, because if you don't produce events, then this is not a reactive application. And by default, it will not produce events. If you take this out, by default, it will simply act as a normal list. So it means it will wait for 10 seconds, and then you will get both products at the very end. And this is not what we want. So if I'm trying to start, I press the debug button, no problem. If I'm trying to start it now, actually I didn't configure everything, so it should fail. I wanted to show you the Netty server, but I just figured out that I forgot to write the connection details to my database, so it will anyway fail. But you will basically maybe see something here. So you will see that I'm going further to that later. But what you will see here is that no, because Netty is after. Okay, no problems. We go back and we configure the details to connect to a database, because that's what's searching for. So to do that, we just go here, and I will say Spring R2DBC URL for the first property, and then this will be if it should be R2DBC MySQL localhost, and then the name of the database was test. And then I do have my user for my local user, and I will specify it is root, and I have no password. So yes, I know, not secure, but it's only on my local computer, so it's only for my test purposes. In a real world scenario, you would have some credentials, and definitely you would never put them in the application properties. You will need to put them in a vault. So maybe I can actually start it already. Okay, the application started, which is of course what I expected to happen, and now it's time to take a look and see what happened. So in my case, you can now clearly see what started, what kind of a server. So I was telling you earlier that that you will not see Tomcat here. The question is also in the chat: why Spring Reactive uses Netty instead of Tomcat? Because Tomcat is a non-reactive server implementation. Tomcat knows how to interpret servlets, but doesn't know how to use a reactive approach to manage the data. So in order to be able to treat the events, to use the data reactively, we need an implementation, a server implementation that knows how to use the data reactively. Tomcat doesn't know that. Netty is one of the implementations that of server that knows how to do that, and it's the default implementation with Spring Boot. Yes, indeed, Tomcat doesn't have reactive support. So we can see mostly the same thing in terms of configuration, aside from the fact that a Netty instance was started instead of Tomcat. The default port is the same one that has been configured, and we also see that Spring Data JDBC repositories have been initialized. So we do expect that everything is in place. Now, to prove how this application works, I will really need to use a reactive client, and unfortunately Postman doesn't know how to work reactively. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use Chrome directly. That helps me knowing how to work reactively with the application. So I'm just putting in the address bar my localhost 8080 product, which is the path that I have configured, and now I'm waiting, and what you will see is that after 5 seconds the first product appears, and then after 5 more seconds the second product appears. So you have seen they haven't been provided both of them at the very end. This is what would have happened in case of a normal non-reactive application. So when you have a normal non-reactive application, call something like that, you will see that it waits for 10 seconds and then you see both of the products. Instead, now we work with events. So that means that every one of the events, in our case the products, they are available for the client whenever they are whenever they have been finished processing. So in our case that means whenever this delay passed, because this delay that we forced here is precisely for you to be able to see this essential difference if we use Postman, what will happen? If you use a non-reactive client, the only thing that will happen is that it will work non-reactively, which means instead of seeing what you have seen now, like you've clearly, and I will show it again just to make sure, you see after 5 seconds the first product, and then after 5 seconds again the second product, you will see both products after 10 seconds. So I will open now Postman, and you will see that as well. Okay, my computer is a bit slow, sorry for that. I'm going to create a new tab and say http localhost 8080 product, and then what I expect to see, because from what I know Postman is not reactive, it will send a response, but instead see here the timing. So when it reached 10 seconds, we've seen both products at the same time. So we didn't see the first one and then after 5 seconds the second one, which means it's consuming them non-reactively, which is possible. So it's not a problem. You can have a non-reactive client consuming a reactive application, but when you do that, you don't gain the benefits of reactive. Then you don't need a non-reactive backend. So that's one of the important points to be considered, is that if you implement a reactive application, then it makes sense that both the server side and the client side are appropriately implement it. So if you write a React application or an Angular application, you should implement it in a way in which it consumes reactively the data, otherwise it doesn't make sense. You've created a server reactively. So I've seen in some cases for projects that I've been consulting, developers implemented the server reactively, but the client was not reactive, or they had multiple services in the backend. The services were implemented reactively, but they didn't use, when one service consumed another, they were not using a client implementation that would have consumed reactively the other service. So in that case, it doesn't help a lot, isn't it? Does it require HTTP2 then? Well, I think it requires HTTP2, even though I'm not sure. I think that's might be only for the sockets, but I will check out to make sure. Can you show the network tab? Oh yes, you mean Chrome, the network tab. So let's make it like this, and I'm going to see network tab here. So let's see what happens. So I started the stream, 5 seconds, so it already shows the waterfall, one of them completed, and then again you see it is displayed a bit differently with blue in this case, the second event that came after a while. So this is what I see here. And in total it took 10 seconds, but 5 was for the first product, and then 5 was for the second one, which is what we expected. Okay, so that's basically it. So what I was again enforcing before answering the question is that we need to implement both the client and the server. So it doesn't really make sense if you guys at some point decide to implement your app reactively. Remember that it's all up, or it doesn't make sense. So don't just use Spring Reactive because it's cool or fancy, because it won't help you. Reactiveness is anyway not a silver bullet. You will learn that you will learn that there are cases in which it makes sense to use it, but there are also cases where it won't bring a lot of benefit. So that's what we will discuss. But I really like Reactive in general, and I really like to use it wherever it's possible, and wherever you have this kind of a situation, it usually makes sense, and it's easier or better to implement the application in a reactive approach rather than a standard one. Maybe since we also have some time, I can actually try to find, so let me try to find a visual VM on my computer if I do have one, and I will show you also how the threads look like behind the scenes. And I don't have a standard application now to compare it with. Maybe in one of the next lessons I will come with a standard application pre-created to show you the difference also, but the idea is that in behind the scenes now, unlike in a standard web application, in a non-reactive one, you don't have anymore the one thread created per every request. So let me see, this is my application here. And I'm going to use Postman, and I'm going to use a sampler here. So I start my CPU, and you see Project Reactor behind the scenes has some of the things already started. So this 1 to 7 to 8 TCPs, 4 to 7 HTTPs. When I'm going to trigger this again, it might or it might not create another thread. So it might be, in this case, it created another thread, but it might be that it doesn't create at all. You will also see that on this thread it's a little bit more difficult to profile, since you don't see exactly what happens behind the scenes. So that is because the task itself can be consumed by different threads, so you will not have necessarily only one thread dealing with everything as we had in standard web applications, which makes profiling on reactive applications also a little bit more difficult than in case of standard applications. Cool. And with that being said, I think I've covered the first lesson of today, where I managed to do what I planned to do. So just write an controller endpoint to repository completely reactive application, and we've seen which are the most important things that you need to understand about the difference between a standard and a reactive application. What we will continue with in the next lesson is teaching you, first of all, how to, instead of using the standard endpoint annotations, define your roots declaratively, and how to consume such an endpoint using a reactive client, which in case of Spring is the web client implementation. Web client implementation can consume both reactive and non-reactive endpoints, but we mostly use it in a reactive application, and we need to use it when we consume something reactively to make sense. With that being said, I hope you enjoyed this lesson, and I hope to see you for the second one, where we go into even more details about reactive applications. Up to that point, thank you very much for being here with me. Have an excellent time for learning further, and see you soon. Cheers, bye bye.